right. Hello. Hi there. Hola. I can't think of another way to say that.
Guten Tag.
Merhaba. Guten Tag. Okay, I was going to say madhaba. Hello, welcome. That's peasant Arabic for anyone's wondering. Guten Tag, German. I say peasant Arabic because I don't trust my family's Arabic. We've been gone for so long, and everyone who left where we came from were uneducated farmers. So here we are, the immigrant story. My grandmother was picking olives at like 7 years old, got married as a teenager, and all for me to be here, single and childless, on a computer, being paid to talk today. Which, what an amazing American story. If my grandparents could see me now, they would have no idea what I'm doing. They're alive, by the way. They're just not here. What a journey. How are you doing today, Jamie?
I am doing well. Happy New Year. I'm glad to be back. It's great to get back to recording for the podcast. And this particular episode, I think, is going to be one that we've never really done before. This is just a conversation with us. We've never done that.
Yeah, I don't know how to talk to you. We've only known each other for 5 years.
We only
known and worked each other for 5 years. How are we going to have this conversation? You didn't ask how I'm doing, so I'm just going to go out and say it. I'm doing terrible. I'm terrible. I feel like we're living in the worst timeline. First of all,
I don't even want to think about that.
No, here's my worst timeline. Okay, I finally get used to living in a desert. I lived here 5 years now, and it's cold. So I acclimated, but now it's too cold for me. Where in New York, this would be nothing where I'm from, right? Absolutely. This is breezy, but here now in New Mexico, Nadia, this is too cold. I had to buy a new coat. I'm cranky. No, I had to buy a space heater and a heating pad. And I'm just sitting there in my office, just all bundled, and I have heat. This is very stupid. It's just I guess, cold-blooded now. So that's
Mexico weather.
New Mexico weather. Yeah. So while we're recording, by the way, just like there's some sort of polar vortex going on across the country. I don't know what that means, and I don't care enough to look it up. But what it means is, what I feel is I'm cold and cranky about it. So me being outside after the sun goes down, it's freezing, and I'm cranky. It's also almost a week since film director David Lynch died, who,
yes.
That's why I said film director, because I'm sure most people have no idea what I'm talking about. But he was one of my heroes, a very strange, absurdist artist. And I loved his work. I feel like watching his weirdo movies and his, most famous show, Twin Peaks, that gave me like hope that you can be a weirdo and be successful, because I'm a weirdo. I'm not as artistically output, clearly, but he's gone. Of all the people that could have been taken, that guy, cool, weirdo, it's cold, so that's what I'm talking about. Worst timeline. I don't know what you're talking about.
No,
but everything.
No, I don't. I refuse to talk about what I mean when it's a bad time. I think everybody knows it's January 22nd, 2 days after January 20th. So I think everybody knows what I'm referring to. There.
Sure. I'm breezy here. On the plus side, I don't know if you were aware of this, but mullets are in. And my hair has grown out perfectly into a perfect mullet. So I am finally in style.
All right.
Taking my entire...
always a good thing, silver linings.
Yes, the silver lining is the silver parts of my hair that are now showing in my mullet, but my stylish mullet. Yeah, and you know what? So that's the good news. I also I don't know if anyone was aware of this, but the average lifespan of a transgender person in America. Do you want to guess what it is?
I don't even want to guess because I know I'll be wrong.
It is between the ages of 30 and 35.
Whoa.
Yes. So why I bring this up is because looking at that lifespan, I'm 35. I am a trans elder.
Yes, you are.
I am younger than you. So that's there you go.
Much younger.
Yeah, so there you go. That's the other worst timeline of oh my goodness. I'm
Oh
old.
my gosh.
I'm old and gray and stylish, so I have to find new artists to appreciate. Honestly, it's just a real terrible January. But at
Well,
least
don't
my hair
forget
looks good.
everything's relative. So relatively, you're still young. You don't have that much gray hair,
Well,
and
they
yes,
can't tell
relatively
me to.
stylish. So, it's good things. It's all good things.
There are good things, and I hope that people who are listening are having much better Januaries. So yeah. So anyway, none of that has anything to do with what we're talking about today.
Nope.
But let's consider this our cold opening. So,
Absolutely.
well, this is like you mentioned earlier. This is a more conversational kind of podcast, so it's a little different than what we've been doing. Like generally, the two types of podcasts so far that we've recorded have been interviews with guests on specific topics, and then also like listener emails. So reading what other people say. So again, we're both under the operation of like other people are kind of leading the conversation. But this time it's just us. That's weird. We'll figure.
Different.
It's
So
very different.
Let's see if we can pull this off. I'm hoping we can.
Well, I appreciate your optimism. Yeah. So today's topic is on career development and adult ed. You want to talk about that? Why did we decide on this?
Well, I think, for me, when we were talking about different episode topics, we were really talking a lot about our goals for the podcast. Why are we even doing this? And a big part of why we are even engaging in this podcast is to educate everybody, whether you're a practitioner, student, or outside the field, just about adult education and what's going on and all the great work that's happening. And I think one of our goals is to get people to really think about what adult education does for New Mexico, for the nation, for the world, when you really want to think about it. And so career development is not necessarily something that we talk about a lot in adult education. And if we want folks to think about what it means to be in adult education, then career development is a big part of that. And I know we're going to talk about this later on, but one thing that I think is kind of common among practitioners is we get into this field kind of by accident and find that we love it. And it was not always, it's not common for this to be a conscious thing. I want to be an adult education practitioner. It's something we kind of fall into. And I really hope that over time we can change that mentality where adult education is more something that people do aspire to get into. And I don't want to, give away too much about what we're going to talk about later, but that is to me why we're doing this.
Okay. Interesting.
So what do you want to add to that? Because I know that you have other reasons.
Yeah. So my reasoning is a big part of my goals for this podcast was to really create the space and these opportunities for practitioners to really think deeply about where they currently are in their careers. I see podcasting as a part of professional learning. I'm not saying that you're going to necessarily, jump in and just know how to do something just from listening to us talk for an hour. But when I think of it is like, this is a starting point. Like this is the kind of content that sparks ideas or could spark ideas, could spark ideas or thoughts. And then the trajectory is up to the practitioner. So that's why I wanted to talk about this. It's also like just trying to figure out what does it mean to have a career in adult ed? And people do. We do. You and I do. And we've met people. But have we ever talked about what that looks like and what that means? And what are people's journeys? Sometimes I feel like I have to ask because we don't always know. like some of our previous guests have worked in adult education for over 20 years. And like at that point, if you don't think this is a career, then we winging it? There's definitely there's definitely some thought there. It's just like we just don't have those conversations, right? So yeah, so that's kind of why I wanted to have this conversation. And I was trying to figure out and failing really of like, what does it mean to have a career in adult education as a practitioner? And what can we talk about? And trying to find the kind of avenue for in. So like, I don't know if there's an awareness here, especially for our audience of like, we do plan these. We plan these as much as we possibly can. When we have guests, we plan questions ahead of time, or in a few instances, we worked with the guests on what they want to talk about, like what the questions they want to answer. We give them the questions ahead of time so they can prepare. So I think of it as pointed conversations. Like there's a topic, there's a goal, but there is that safety, that space to share, and also that psychological safety, right? So now we're kind of putting ourselves in the hot seat though, because we are going to be vulnerable in a sense and talk about our own careers. And the thing about talking about careers, and I know it sounds kind of weird, but like there are personal attachments to it. And that comes from so many different directions. Is it the students, the institution? What are you getting out of it? Because I feel like that's also something we kind of touched upon in different ways. It's like, you as a practitioner gotta be getting some out of this. Otherwise, why are you here? And that can mean so many different things. If this is just a job for you to have enough money to go do what you love, or to take care of or have like, a stable job or whatever, so you can do it for your family, and we're going to get into this, but like for a long time, adult education was something very part-time for me. So it was more like, it was the thing I loved to do, but it wasn't the sustaining thing. So it was kind of like my day job was the sustaining thing, and adult ed was like my little passion project. And there's nothing wrong with the opposite of that. If your teaching job or your director job or your data job, whatever it is, gives you that space so that you can, I don't know, write music or snowboard every year, or just have a space just to provide for your family and have that opportunity, why not? There's nothing wrong with that. But we're going to talk about something like real specific here of just like, what does it mean to have a career in adult ed? What are our journeys? So when I say our specifically, right now, I'm talking about Jamie and Nadia. Mm-hmm. How did we get here? How did we get to this point? What are the tools, the resources that we use that got us to this point? So how we did it is we split this up. We had these conversations. We split this up into questions that are based on like, slightly kind of the general theme is career development, but like we split into like different topics, and we're kind of just going to freeform it. We're going to see how this goes. Like we mentioned before, we never did this before. This is all new. This is weird.
Yep.
Usually how we plan this is we kind of, and people probably heard those too, is like, we kind of like plan ahead of time who asks what question. And we don't really do that. But I think I'm just going to kind of do like sort of pseudo facilitator here, and I'll just take that on. So the biggest thing right here is the big question is, how did you get here?
So when we think about that, when we think about our origins, Nadia, why don't you go first and talk about how you got into adult ed?
Yeah. So like mentioned, I really got into this. It's hard not to get personal when you're talking about a career, and specifically about career because it's such a big part of my life. So to get personal, I have always struggled with work. I'm not to say necessarily that I was a bad worker or a bad employee. I thought at times, especially in my darkest moments, that I was, but I think that was all really in my head. I wasn't bad enough to get fired from anywhere. I really haven't. But I always struggled with, what am I supposed to be doing? Why am I doing this? Why am I here right now? Especially when I worked in customer service. Because in customer service, there is no rationality. And there's this idea, and I'm going to point this out because this quote has been taken out of context so much that no one knows what it means. The customer is always right. So I had to look this up because I needed to know why I had to have these people in my face and frankly treating me very disrespectfully at times. Most of the time, not my fault. Sometimes I'll take some credit. Like sometimes I was a little bit of a jerk, but most of the time it's just people being angry at me. And the fun fact is that's not the whole quote. The customer is always right. It's the customer's always right as he chooses. And what that means is that if the customer wants to pick up the ugliest hat you have ever seen in your whole life and wants to pay a lot of money for it, that's their business. That's what that means. It does not mean that you let people walk all over you, but that's how we have decided as a culture. That's what that means. Right.
Right.
So,
wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Here, fun fact. This is all related. Trust me. So I spent a lot of time working these dumb retail jobs, just trying to survive. I'm from New York, as I mentioned. I moved out of my house, and generally in my family, women don't move out until they get married. So I was the first person to do that. So I really got no support here. My parents did not know what I was doing, and they were like very confused by it. But I just needed my own space. I needed to grow. And it was hard to articulate that to people who got married in their early 20s. Right? Of like, what are you talking about? We were having, like, they had like 3 kids by the time they were where I am now, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So anyway, I just kept jumping from like job to job, trying to find some sort of purpose. And I also went into higher education or I pursued a graduate degree because I just didn't know what else to do. And I really loved media, and I still do. I love media, which is also related. Just because you love something does not mean it has to be your job. And I think everyone needs to hear that, because it doesn't make your job something you love. What it does is it takes something you love and makes it your job. So fun fact. So anyway, I got my master's. By that time, I was so burnt out. I was really struggling, and I couldn't find work because, I had a master's in media, which is very specific to higher ed.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I didn't have this refinement or this polishing. I'd say refinement, but because at the very least, I didn't have any office skills or anything. So I couldn't just go get an admin job. Eventually, I got this adjuncting job with my old department. So, of course, being an adjunct still didn't pay me enough to live. And no, so I was adjuncting, and then I was also a barista. So I was a barista, which was slightly better than the other customer-facing jobs, but still in that sort of like, what am I doing? I really don't like being treated poorly, and it's really hard to not be treated poorly in customer service. Like, that's just a part of the job. It's a part of what makes the job hard. There's many other parts, but that is it. So I just kept hopping, and I used my network to get kind of a more full-time gig that wasn't necessarily like food service or working a coffee shop, but it was still customer facing, and it wasn't great. I was miserable, but I didn't like adjuncting either. And I think a part of that, the biggest part was there was just, and I'm not saying that all departments are like this at all, but my alma mater basically just gave me a class and left me to free fall. I didn't know how to lesson plan. I didn't get a degree in education. So I had no idea what I was doing. And those students, had no idea what they were doing either. They were just like, I'm taking a selective and you're my professor. What are you doing? Should you know better? Fun fact, no. I should. I did not. Anyway, so I left adjuncting because it was just too much. The commute, the low pay, and it wasn't getting me where I wanted to go, because adjuncting essentially became a dead-end job. So I was really lost. And I saw like some volunteer opportunities, and my local library in Brooklyn had a volunteer tutoring for adults, because I knew I didn't want to work with children. That's the one thing I knew that was not my purpose. Was like, I definitely, at the very least, no, I don't want to work with children, but I am interested in education. I just didn't know what that looked like. So I went through their tutor training, which I gotta tell you, I didn't learn nothing. Nothing that was in that training that was so long gave me anything. I know you're laughing. See, like, no one's gonna know where this is. So it's fine. No one's gonna know this. So I didn't learn nothing. I had to kind of wing it, but at the very least, there was this structured test. This is a long story, but basically, when I volunteered, I put my resume to find a library to work in. because they had a tutor training for like all the libraries, right? And the person that was looking for tutors saw my resume and saw that I was an adjunct. And he told me I was an adjunct. And that's why I knew that I wanted you, because you have that similar experience. And you at the very least will know some form of lesson planning, which I taught myself because, like I said, my department didn't help me. There's a lot of self-learning here, guys. So even though I went through like volunteer literacy tutoring, I ended up volunteering for HSC. So I was working 5 days a week, and then 1 day a week on Saturdays, I was tutoring HSC, and I loved it. I wasn't getting paid, but I felt this connection. There was this new goal. I was really excited. And eventually, like, the tutoring circle grew to a point. And part of this, I'd like to take some credit, is because I had consistent students. Part of it was that. The other part was there just wasn't any other opportunity for HSC on Saturdays or the weekend. So that kind of worked in my favor and got big to a point of like, okay, we can't actually keep you as a tutor. So we got to hire you. So they hired me as a part-time instructor. So now I'm making a little money. I'm making a little money. Mm-hmm. And hey, going from a tutor to an instructor, that's a leap. And then I started thinking, okay, I really like this. I'm just working this other job to keep me sustained. But what does that mean? What does a career in adult ed look like? And where I was, it was really hard. It was almost impossible to find it. It felt like there was like a secret network of adult educators that I could not tap into or find. I tried every opportunity I could to go to like different trainings, because they always had those, like they had trainings, they had events, they had big staff meetings with all the different, libraries in that system. So I went to as much as I could, which, by the way, was also like, not great for my day job, because I was like calling out or like leaving earlier. So like really not great. So in that case, I was a bad employee, but I was being a bad employee to be a good employee to my students.
Right.
But anyway, I was looking to get out of New York, and the next step was, okay, if I'm going to get out of New York, I'm going to have to look for a career I want, like a job in a career that I want. I want to do adult ed. And that was my focus. Like, this is the only thing that I could really stick to and didn't make me feel like it's some kind of severe existential crisis. So I job hopped. I found an ad, on Indeed. So online, I found a job for a full-time teaching at HSC, which I've never seen before. And it's rare to find. And I was in Albuquerque. So that's how I got here. I kind of moved in. I moved up. I really liked it. I looked for new challenges, and I wanted to grow the field. So that was kind of like, that is like my ideas here, is like, I like this field and I want to keep contributing to it, but contribute in like different ways. So I did a lot of self-learning too. So I was going to as many trainings as I could that was available to me. I also did a lot of volunteering, and that helped me connect with people online with like different New Mexico kind of stuff. There was one point where someone told me, and I don't remember who this is now, but basically they were like, Nadia, I see you like everywhere. I'm like, yeah, I keep showing up to stuff. It was like, that's how, and they knew me before I knew their name, because they just kept seeing me in all these different meetings and all these volunteer stuff, and just trying to jump in and get as much as I could. So eventually I moved into administration. And throughout that time, I was also studying instructional design, because I felt like that also sparked my interest. So it's in education, adjacent, but like how to create learning experiences. And that kind of ended up like, through that got me here, which is professional learning, which I do use a lot of instructional design and my own research. Yeah. And Jamie, you were the one that hired me. So like, you kind of got me into New Mexico. You were part of my network. I worked for you. And that's kind of...
I will add that this was during the pandemic, so it was online for quite a long time. We did not meet each other in person for several months. Like, it was a long time. It was like 6 months before we actually met in person.
Yeah, because I was teaching online. Mm-hmm. We were meeting online. We were still connecting, but in that sense, and building the network, but it was all online because everything was new.
Right.
right? And we were all in shutdown mode. We were still figuring out ourselves. And throughout this process, I kept teaching myself stuff. And like I said, I'll get into that a little later, but I taught myself stuff like instructional design, and I always teach myself stuff, and I try to add like what I learned to the field. So that's kind of how I got here, was like teaching myself stuff. And I don't know if you remember this, Jamie, but way after you hired me, I did ask you, why did you hire me? And you were like, because you showed us your Google Classroom and we knew that you could teach online. And
I do remember that. Mm-hmm.
I was like, the bar's that low? And that was not a low bar, guys. I just did not expect.
And again, you got to think back to that time period where having something that was purely online was still relatively new, at least here. And so I think it's become much more of the norm in the 5 years since. But at the time, not so much.
Absolutely. So, yeah. So that was kind of where we're at, is just, a big part of that was my program. They helped create that Google Classroom, but also I was teaching myself how to use it too in my spare time. So it was kind of like my network and my experience coupled with self-learning helped get me to this place, those are the tools I constantly rely on. But anyway, that's how I got here. And then of course, that big question of how do we have these conversations? How do we help foster these deep thoughts about our field, about adult ed? That's how we got this podcast, which basically I had a stupid idea of like, how can we connect with other people? How can we get people talking to each other? And then Jamie was like, yeah, let's do it. And yeah, so Jamie's like, let's do it. We'll work on it together. And Jamie is, as mentioned in previous episodes, is our producer, our tech person who taught herself editing and putting stuff together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, I think that kind of going back a little bit, I think that's almost been our MO. You would come to me with an idea and I'd say, oh, that's a great idea. Let's do it. More specifically, you do it. You'd have to figure out ways to get it done. And this podcast is just one of many examples of that. Another example was the volunteer training that you developed for the Albuquerque Adult Learning Center, which, we've even done workshops on, for conferences. That was a huge undertaking that, even though I was the support, that was primarily what you developed. And really quickly, there was something else that you said that really stuck out to me when you said in New York that the adult education field was something that was really kind of a niche that was hard to get into, not very well known. And I recall a conversation that I had with Amber Gallup a while back, where she said that she felt that it was the same in New Mexico, that adult ed is not necessarily something easy to get into. And, I think that there's a point there. I really think that that's accurate. It's either unknown or there are just not a lot of opportunities. And I'll talk more about this later, but, I would really love to see that change. I would really love for adult education to be more accessible. So, that really struck me when you said that. It's like, wow, that's just not here in New Mexico. It's elsewhere as well.
Oh, I think it's like everywhere. I think it's so hard. I mean, it kind of goes back. I don't know if you've had this experience, but I feel like I've talked to people about this experience of like, they ask, what do you do? And it's like adult ed, and they have no idea what you're talking about. And like, oh, GD? Yeah. I was like, well, it's a lot more than that, but yeah.
I would always just say teacher. It was just the easiest answer. What do you do? I'm a teacher. And then, if the conversation went further, well, I teach adult ed, the people that didn't finish high school. And I don't think that that's an answer that most people expect.
No. And there's also, sometimes I got this weird, and like I said, I don't know if other people got this, of like, oh, that must be so rewarding. I'm like, yeah, I'm the savior here helping adults get a high school diploma. Absolutely not, guys. I do not think of myself as a savior. If anything, I thought of it as I was a facilitator and they were doing all the work. I was giving the work. I was supporting them. They're doing the work. It is rewarding. I find it, I found teaching very rewarding. And like I said, it gave me so much purpose. But there's still that that kind of idea sometimes that comes out of people who are in different situations or quote unquote, more vulnerable populations or whatever, that like we're supposed to save them. No, they're saving us.
And
They're
that's
giving us jobs.
ridiculous. Yeah, that's absolutely ridiculous to think of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, like that long story was basically like me trying to find purpose, finding meaning, and finding like a space as well as a network of support, because it's not just the thing of like career development is there needs to be that network of support, whatever that looks like, because you're not getting anywhere by yourself. Human beings are a social species.
We are.
We need each
and
other.
I think that we've all been in that place where we're trying to find out what is it we're going to do, quote unquote, when we grow up, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to figure out who we want to be. How are we going to make our life meaningful? And you're not wrong when you say that we're getting personal, because our careers, I think, oftentimes, if not all the time, are tied to our lives in such a big way. It's part of our identities. Not everything. It's not our entire identity, but it's definitely part of it. And so, how could it not be personal to some degree?
Absolutely. I mean, we also have to consider the time, like how much time, and this is making an assumption that you're working like 40 hours a week, right? And that's assuming you're full-time. That's 40 hours out of an entire week. That's a lot. That's a lot of hours. That's a lot of time to be focused or in a different, if you work, I work remotely, but if I didn't work remotely, like being in an office, being at a school, being whatever, community center, wherever you're working, like that is so much of your life. And we spend a lot of our lives working.
We do.
So yeah, it can get pretty personal, especially with the people you're with all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I took forever to give out my answer of how did I get here. How did you get here, Jamie?
Well, here we go. We're going to get really personal again. My journey was incredibly unexpected. Growing up, I knew I was going to go to college. It was never a question of if I was going to go to college. It was, what am I going to study? And I've always been fascinated with the human mind. And so psychology was a natural pathway for me. And my bachelor's and master's are both in psychology. And originally I had wanted to be a therapist, and the specialty changed. One of the most prevalent being end-of-life therapy, helping people who are terminally ill or facing end of life and helping them to emotionally and mentally make that transition well. And that was what was going to happen. And, I know it's kind of cliche when they say, I've heard this quote, men plan, God laughs. And that's exactly what happened. Just life was not going to be that way for me. I was one of those that got married really young. I got married at 19. And, there was a series of really bad decisions that were made on the part of me and my husband, my husband and then me going along with it, that landed me in some hot water, landed us both in some hot water, and landed me in federal prison for nearly 4 years. And I was 20 years old when we got arrested, and I was 22 when I self-surrendered. And that's a long time to have to deal with that, especially being at such a young person who had never had so much as a parking ticket. I was the ultimate goody-goody. I was valedictorian of my high school graduating class. I was always this almost obsessive rule follower. This was so outside of my norm that I didn't know how to deal with it. I was terrified. And I remember telling my attorney that I was going to die if I went to prison. And I very genuinely meant that. I was terrified. And he looked at me, and this is somebody who had been a lawyer for a very long time at that point. And he didn't laugh at me, which I appreciated. He just said, "No, you won't." And then he said something that has stuck with me for the rest of my life. He said, "Jamie, you are educated. There are people in there who can't even read. You have an opportunity to help other people. Do not waste that. And I clung to that like a lifeline. I mean, that was such a lifeline for me, especially knowing that I was going to go to prison. You know, there was that point where I knew, and when he told me this, at that point, I had no idea what the outcome was going to be. And as you know, the year and a half or so went on, I, of course, knew that that was going to be my fate. And so when you get to that point of acceptance, you start to make a plan. So when I did go in, I decided, okay, I'm going to try to get a job in the education department. And it took a little while, but I eventually did. I got in. One of the teachers there gave me a tutoring position, and I am forever grateful to that person for giving me that chance, because for the first 3 years of my career, that was my experience. That's how I started in the field, was as a tutor. And so I tutored, like I said, for 3 years at this federal women's facility in Fort Worth, Texas. And I had the absolute privilege of helping those women to reach their educational goals. And it did not matter that they were being mandated to be there. The experiences were the same. The joy, that ultimate joy that they felt when I had the opportunity to tell them that they passed the test, was the same. I remember being picked up and spun around because this woman was just so excited about the fact that she had finished. And that was how I found my purpose there. And that was how I found my purpose as I left. So, like I said, it was just over 3 years there teaching as a tutor, because that was the only opportunity we had. But that was a full-time job. So we were tutors underneath the staff who were the full-time teachers. And so it was absolutely full-time, but I loved it. We taught, I think, 3 classes a day, 5 days a week. And so when I came back, I was fortunate enough to find a job within 2 weeks of being released with, at the time, Southern New Mexico, which became Albuquerque GED, which then became Albuquerque Adult Learning Center. And, worked my way up from being a part-time teacher to a full-time teacher to the program coordinator, and then education coordinator and education director, and have pretty much done, I did everything under the sun within that organization: direct instruction, data entry and analysis, accounting, the reimbursement processing, and supervising the staff. You talked about it a little earlier. I hired you, so I was kind of in charge of all the hiring. And then from there, it was a natural progression then to move up to being the executive director of NMEA. So I've had the privilege of really having experience in almost every aspect of adult ed, from being a tutor to a teacher to a supervisor to a data professional, to a trainer. I've also been training and providing professional learning since 2014. So it's been just about 10 years, because it was at the very end of 2014. So for about, a decade now, I've been providing professional learning and still continue to do that. I found that I loved it a whole lot, and just love that I have that opportunity. And then with NMEA, I now am in this other role where I have the opportunity to speak with people of influence, these legislators, whether they're state or federal or even local, and try to advocate for adult educational literacy along with student ambassadors, and having this opportunity to train student ambassadors and work really closely with these phenomenal student leaders. And I'll talk more about that in a little while as well, but definitely not something that I ever expected. If I could go back and talk to my 18-year-old self who's about ready to graduate high school and say, hey, guess what? You're going to go to prison, and that's where you're going to find your career, by the way. And that's the area that you're going to spend the rest of your life loving and being passionate about. I think I would slap myself. It's like, no, there's no way, because I really was just that much of a goody-goody, but it happened. That choice that I made impacted me in a terrifying and horrible way. And at the same time, in such a beautiful way that I could have never anticipated, because it brought me to this field. I would have never considered it, even though I loved school and I loved, playing teacher and things like that. I don't think that I would have really considered this as a career had that not happened to me. And, this isn't easy to talk about. It's not. It's something that some people know that I've told individually. It was something that I would share with my students from time to time when I'd have a new cohort. But I've never been public about this story in such a way, sharing it like this on a podcast where literally anybody could find that out. This is, very admittedly difficult for me to share. But at the same time, that experience was so pivotal in what brought me to this field that I did decide to finally share that. So yeah, that is my crazy and completely unexpected journey in adult ed.
Well, I first want to say thank you so much for sharing this story. It's so important and it's so valuable, and it really speaks to the value of adult education, not just for the students, because like you said, you went through the high school system and you went to college, but it also speaks to how it gives, the field really gives to our practitioners. And again, just thank you so much for sharing your story. It's really meaningful, and it's really hard to talk about this kind of stuff. So I'm just so grateful that you're able to share this on this platform, especially on this project that you and I have really built together. And there is absolutely, and this is obvious, but there's absolutely nothing shameful about where people come from. It's where they're going. And you've been a huge support to adult education in New Mexico and a proponent for it for so long. And it's just incredible. And New Mexico's very lucky to have you.
Thank you.
Of course.
I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's such an incredible space where we're at.
It really is. And I almost can guarantee that if we were to talk to 5 different practitioners, we'd hear 5 amazing stories as well, And I think you had said this a little bit earlier. You never expect to hear how people got here, those origin stories. And I would love to hear more,
I would too. That's why we're going to ask people, but
we are.
we're gonna ask, surprise, when we send this episode out. We're gonna ask people to share their stories if they're comfortable. Being so vulnerable in a space is just so meaningful. Yeah. And like I said, I just appreciate that. And I know that you and I have had very different journeys, but I think the similarity is that adult education in very different ways both gave us purpose.
Yes, 100%.
That's the commonality here. Yeah. So it kind of gets into, now we're getting like going back, and now it feels weird to be like, okay, well, now we're going to answer the next question.
Right.
But
it's kind of a way to move forward, right? So we talked about where we came from, and you said it yourself, it's not always about where we come from, it's where we're going. And so when we think about where we're going, it's natural to have goals, right? So what are some goals? Let's talk about that. What are some goals that we have set for our own career development?
So I just want to say for my answer is that my goals have changed significantly, and they still do over and over again. And a big part of that was where I was in life. And part of the stability that adult ed has given me, having that space, having that, regular cash flow, frankly, as well as, personal support, as well as my network of adult ed practitioners, people I've gotten close to, as well as my own personal network of community and my partner and friendships and all this is related, I swear. But originally, like I mentioned, in the first question, is I just wanted to survive. And that was, I didn't have dreams and some people do, and not everyone does. And I'm not saying that any one's necessarily better than the other. But growing up, I didn't have dreams of what I wanted to do. My goal was to be as self-sustaining as possible. I didn't want to get married, queer. I wouldn't use that term at the time, but now it's like I'm queer. I didn't want to get married. I didn't want to be a parent. So I didn't know what my options were. And like all parents only have the tools that are given to them. So my parents were like, they didn't force me to do anything, but they were just not sure what to do. I was very different. I am still very different from the people I grew up with. I'm queer, I'm trans and non-binary, which again, that's also something kind of new for me. I didn't know what was going on. All I knew was like, I need to make money so that I don't have to rely on people and then get stuck in a life that I didn't want. So my first career goals were find a job that pays better than the last one. And I kept jumping like that. And when you have a broad goal, and I think in a weird way, some teachers can understand this, because when you're a teacher and you're teaching specifically, I'm speaking in terms of high school equivalency. The equivalent of that is your student coming to you and saying, I want the HSC. That's my goal. And it's like, that doesn't take into factor, what are your current skills? What are the skills you need to build? What are the subjects you need? Where are you at now? There's so many more, being so broad. Now, that's an ultimate goal, obviously, is getting your HSC, right? Or GED, usually what students call it. But just saying, if you're saying goals for the next 3 months and you say, I want my HSC, there's a lot of students that aren't able to get the whole HSC in 3 months. So you got to be more specific. And again, this is related, okay? But I didn't have that specificity. I didn't have those dreams. I was just so focused on getting to this point of total self-sufficiency, which I never really did. I did in a lot of ways, but it's really hard to live alone. And especially in a place like New York, it was very expensive. And it was just such a struggle. But I kind of, as I job hopped and hunted and sort of narrowed down, I also took a lot of free at the time, online classes and stuff, and looking on YouTube and just trying to find ways I can build my skills so I can get out of customer service. I tried a lot of different things, and things didn't really work for me until instructional design. Instructional design made perfect sense to me, and it still does. And I still use that as my base framework for a lot of what I do. But you have to figure out where you want to be. You can't just come out of I just want to be so. Then I could have done anything. Why wasn't I a stockbroker or a nurse or a school teacher or a bus driver? Right? Because that wasn't the answer. That I was not asking myself the right question. I had to get to that point. So I had to get to that place of I'm stable enough where I can actually see my future, because I could not. And as mentioned earlier, because of being queer and not knowing a ton of queer people who survive, who live that long and sustainably, it took a while for me to find people like that. They exist. But the reason why I bring that up is when you don't have models, how do you imagine a future? Because I was already at a point in my early 20s, right, where I've already had a life that was completely different from my family's. My parents, my cousins and aunts and uncles. And family and friends, those are your reference points. And where my friends were at, same thing at the time. It's I was already at a point that was very different from them. So where am I going? I don't know. I have to figure it out. So I get to this place of stability. And then, of course, other questions are raised. And that's when, I guess this is an identity podcast episode. It's in my early 30s, I have suspected, had the means to get assessed for autism and ADHD. And I have that. So my whole life, I've been spinning around like a top, trying to figure out why things don't make sense to me. How do I get from point A to point B? And really needed to know myself. And a form of that is called metacognition, is like how you learn. And if I knew some of this stuff 10 years earlier, my journey would have been very different, but it would some parts would have been easier. And a big part of that career development is really knowing yourself. You have to figure out who you are and how you work and where you are now, where you want to be later. Like, you really have to have these kinds of questions down. And it's hard. It's hard to do that with life. We have so much going on. Yeah. So I had to like figure all this stuff out. And a big part of that was being in a stable place. So having stable housing, having support, having a 2-income household really saves a lot, guys. So I had to like get these diagnoses. I had to get to the stable place, but then I had to like ask questions of myself and then keep switching up those questions of like, what does that mean? Where am I going? What can I learn? What is something that is within my control? What is without? There's an educational theory called the zone of proximal development. And we'll probably like link that to our website. But basically it's concentric circles. And the smallest circle on the interior is what you already know. Outside of that is what you can learn with support. And then outside of that is like completely out of your wheelhouse. And the reason why I bring the zone of proximal development is because it gives me a framework for understanding myself. So that's how I got into instructional design, because education and instructional design are very closely related. So I could grow a little bit in that direction with support. And I'm still learning. Like, a lot of the stuff I teach myself, but I could make that leap. Now, let's compare that. So like my educational experience, but then let's say one of my thoughts was like, maybe I should learn programming, and the learning programming can give me a stable job. That is not really related. And not that they necessarily need to be related, but there has to be some sort of skill transfer in some way, or the skills you have can get you to a point of where the skills that you need. And because they're so separate and they're so different, and frankly, programming is not in my interest, really. I was just desperate. And sometimes being desperate isn't helpful. It skews your patterns, your thought processes, your rationales. So I needed to focus, and that focus was getting to a stable point. So I'm in adult ed, okay. And like, where do I want to be? And professional development is where I want to be. I want to facilitate and build learning experiences so practitioners can do what they do and do it the best way possible. And also give them opportunities to learn in different ways. So I use the term modality. So different modalities. So we have in-person training, we have hybrid, we have asynchronous, right? So we have micro-learning. A part of that is this podcast. So like just all those different modalities of how people can learn, because people learn in so many different ways. And that's kind of like puzzles for me. And a puzzle is only interesting when you have a general idea of where you should get started. Maybe I could be totally wrong here. Got it. Yeah. And my podcast media background coupled with my instructional design, my education background, kind of the podcast came about. Like, it's a mix of all even though it might not seem super related, they are, because people can learning content and being self-directed. Like, that's how I put it, is like, theoretically, and I haven't quite put this down yet on paper, but it's like, you listen to an episode, maybe we're I don't know, interviewing somebody about like intake in a program. You listen to this expert talk about their methodologies and what they've tried, what works, what doesn't, what they're doing right now. You take some of that, and you compare it to what your program's doing. Like, let's say that's your job, right? Or part of your job of intake. So then you listen to that podcast, you write some notes, and then it gives you avenues of what might work, what might not work. And it starts that chemical reaction in our brain that we call thinking, of like, it sparks that interest. And then you learn more about what you need to do. You figure out what you need to learn so that you can switch up intake at your program, because this is an issue. And that is the spark of learning. And that's what I want from this. And all of that is what is your goals? And that's one of my goals. My career development goals is like having a vision of where I want people to learn and giving them that opportunity.
Right. I love that.
God, I'm talking so much today.
Please edit that out. Of course.
Yeah. So, Jamie, what about you? What were some of your career development goals that you set for yourself?
I find it really interesting when you were talking about how initially your goal was just to survive. And despite what I shared earlier, I think I've been really fortunate in that that's not ever really been this big concern of mine. I've had the opportunity to just ask myself, what do I love to do? Despite this coming accidentally, I found it and I was able to just stick with it. And so being a teacher, I think that initially, because I did spend, I think it was close to 15 years teaching, I really was just trying to be the best teacher I can be. And I think that a lot of instructors can relate to that. How can I improve upon my instructional practice? What can I do that will make my teaching more effective? How can I make sure that my students are getting the knowledge and the skills that they need that will then transfer not just to the HSC exam, but to college and careers? And so when I was thinking about that, I really didn't have a lot of resources by way of, okay, how do I find professional learning? Going back to the 3 years, my first 3 years, when I was a tutor in the federal prison, there was no professional development for tutors. That did not exist. We followed what we were told to do by our teaching, by the instructors, the staff. We did what we were told. There was literally nothing else to do other than that. We followed the curriculum they set. We used the materials that they asked. That was that. So coming outside of that situation into running my own classroom, it was something I had to really ease myself into because I didn't know what to look for. And so I literally was using materials that I had already been using at the correctional facility, and that was working for me. So I was used to doing that and following the progression in the textbooks. And then pretty quickly, I was able to attend conferences. And so the conferences were the biggest part of my professional learning. So, okay, I had this goal of being the best teacher I could be, and this is how I got there, by just going to all of these conferences. And then eventually, as I'm seeing what my bosses are doing, I realized that it was a goal of mine to then be a supervisor or director. And I really felt that running an adult ed program was just a natural part of my trajectory. It's where I wanted to go. And I, for the most part, achieved that by being the education director. I was supervising the programming, and that's what I loved to do. So I really do feel like I met that goal in particular when I say becoming a director and having that goal of being a leader for a program. I felt like, okay, I met that. When I started providing training, that I think was when I really started thinking about, okay, what are my goals when I am providing professional learning? And really, it was my goal to provide practitioners with knowledge and transferable skills that they could use in their classroom. What can I give to them that they can apply in their classrooms relatively quickly, relatively easily, if possible? So I had to really think about what kind of professional learning I needed to achieve that goal. And that was even more difficult. How do you train the trainer type thing? What kind of professional learning can I participate in that would do that? So, it's not terribly different than trying to provide the best instruction you can for your students. Training adult education practitioners is very similar because we're all adult learners. And so it was just, again, how can I provide that high quality professional learning that will help these practitioners in their practice? And I think especially in the last year, more so than in the past, a huge goal of mine is to become more effective at advocacy. And I know that's pretty nebulous. Like, what does that mean to be effective with advocacy? And that's something that I'm still trying to figure out, because I have been fortunate to have had a lot of training, really, in advocacy and a lot of practice in advocacy. But I think as I go along, my goals change. I learn more about what it means to advocate. I learn more about the timelines that are required. At what point of the year am I supposed to be doing what, for example? And so the more I learn about that, the more my goals will evolve so that I can kind of refine for myself what that means to be an effective advocate. And I am still providing professional learning. It's still something that I love to do. But at this point in my career, being that advocate legislatively, actually being active so that adult educational literacy is not this unknown or misunderstood field, that legislators fully understand what we do. And that's a tall order, because they have to know a lot about a lot of things. So how can I ensure, with the help of the advocacy committee, with the help of the student ambassadors, with the help of the entire field, how can I ensure that our legislators, especially our state legislators, but also our federal, how can I ensure that they are fully aware of the impact of adult education, that they understand, not just agree, but actually understand why it is important that we get sustainable funding, more funding every year, so that we can actually meet the need, because we are not doing it with the current funding we have. That is where my heart is right now. And it's very exciting. I love it. I feel very, 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 very fortunate to be in the position that I can do that and spend a lot of my time and effort doing that. So yeah, I think that my goals have really evolved over the years, depending on what I was doing at the time, whether I was instructing or leading or providing professional learning or being an advocate. It just changes based on that.
Yeah, I'm sure it's going to change continuously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it does for everybody.
It should.
It should.
Yeah, or maybe not. I don't know. I'm not expert here.
So when we think about just, we've talked about this already. We've alluded to it a few times, but just having a career in adult ed is just not something that most people think about early on. They sometimes fall into it. And if you're not in adult education, you don't really know what it is. So, when we were thinking about this episode, we were really thinking about, what does it mean to have a career in adult education? What does that really mean? So what does that mean for you, Nadia?
That's a hard one. I feel like it's still continuing, because adult ed, like we've mentioned, it's really hard to get in, and sometimes it's hard to move. Sometimes there's really only lateral moves, or sometimes it's, and for most of the time, this is the case of, like, you can really only move from like teaching to being a director.
It's pretty rare. Like, there's not a lot of opportunity for that.
That too. Like, so sometimes it's so hard. And I do consider myself very fortunate. But for me, to have a career in adult ed means so many different things. Like, it gave us purpose. Adult ed gave me a vision, but it also gave me a supportive professional network and gave me opportunities I didn't have before. Like, I have a job where I can travel. I could, like we talked about, have creative projects. I can vary my day if I need to. And in the cases of some of our students, and I would say some of our practitioners, adult ed can give people class mobility, opportunities to really grow and to make more money than where they come from. And sometimes it gives them multiple opportunities to move up, to get out of where you are at, or to improve where you're at. But at the same time, we're such a resource-starved system. And in some cases, like, you're kind of in a position where the university system has so much red tape. It's so hard to move up. It's so hard to get a pay raise. It's so hard to not do the work of 3 people. It's really unfair. Or, like not paying instructors to lesson plan or to prep, but only what they do in the classroom, just because of how the system is set up. So there can be like a lot of cases where it's very unfair. It's so complicated and so nuanced. But also to have a career in adult ed is to kind of be in a interesting position, especially when you get those opportunities. Like I say, like I said earlier, volunteering for different work groups, to volunteer or work for conferences. I was on the NMEA board for a year before I was hired by Propel. Those gave me so many opportunities to better understand the system, as well as trying new things. And like what you mentioned earlier, Jamie, of like, so I'm the kind of person that just has these out there ideas, and I bring it to you, or, you're not my supervisor anymore, but like, I would bring them to you and be like, hey, what if we do this? And you're like, figure it out.
Yep.
Right. And that hasn't changed much, honestly. It's just the price is different. But saying similar is like, I have had those opportunities to try really weird things. And sometimes they work out really well. And sometimes they work out medium. And sometimes they don't work out at all. Or sometimes they don't even get off the ground. But to have a career in adult education means you're kind of in this weird forefront where there's so much opportunity to really give back to your community. And you talked about advocacy. So you're talking at the larger scale of like your New Mexico community. But it could also mean like working in a program that's providing education and support and resources at the program level. So like a smaller community base. So like thinking of a city, a town, a neighborhood, whatever it is. So like adult education, I don't even know if I answered this question. Like, what does it mean to have a career in adult education? It's chaotic. It could be very chaotic. It could be very stressful. It could feel stagnant at times, but it can also give you so much. It's given me a lot. I feel like if I take a step back and look at all the skills I developed because people believed in me and gave me that supportive network, I don't know if I could have gotten this far in other fields, because you kind of need that first step in, that first, like you said, someone has to take a chance on you. And this field can be very strained and strange. And in some cases, you're doing the work of 3 people. Like I keep mentioning, because I really don't like that. I really don't.
No. And it shouldn't be something we get used to. I got to say, it was something that I was very used to for a very long time. And I don't think it's something we should get used to. Yes, I realize it's a necessary evil, but
I think at times
we should always accept that.
I don't know. I'd like to hope so, though. I like to hope, because you and I are in very different places, but we're also in these positions of influence in different ways. And what does it mean to be in a position of influence for a field? Because in a sense, you are a leader. You're a leader. I'm a leader. And what are we offering people? What are we giving them that space for? And I keep talking about the podcast because it's one that keeps coming back to me, of just like, this is a platform. And you and I have set goals for it. We've really thought so much. We've had many conversations. We put a lot of time and resources into it, finding people to interview who want to be interviewed, talking about what are the aspects in this field, what is going on, where do we see change in the forefront, Yeah.
I think you make a really good point, is that it could be a lot of wonderful things, a lot of frustrating things, a lot of chaotic things. I totally agree with you that having a career at adult ed can be chaotic, and it changes, a lot. But that also creates a lot of opportunity for creativity and risk, good risk, where you're trying new things.
Oh, absolutely. There's also, I'm a firm proponent, and I've probably said this to you like a dozen times, but like through constraint, there is opportunity. You just have to find it, and you have to know how to find it. And it's really hard. If you're like, and I have my sympathy, if you're in a program that's really underfunded, you don't have enough people, you do have to be creative and you have to figure out solutions. And sometimes those solutions aren't always ideal, but we find a way. We've talked to so many interesting people on this podcast. I guess it's a time for reflection, really. So one of the things that we also, we touched on in different ways are like, what are some valuable resources that have helped you in your career? That was like, that was the question that you and I came up with. And I think we talked about them in different ways.
I think we did. We've talked about, a lot of the people in our lives that have come in, the mentors that we had, especially. And when I thought about this question, I was really thinking a lot about, okay, who mentored me? I think that as human beings, one of our greatest resources is each other. And so it's probably no surprise that, Gloria Rael from the Albuquerque Adult Learning Center was my initial mentor, a huge mentor, teaching me how to be a leader, how to be a supervisor, how to be a director. I got so much of my initial skill set from her. And going back even further, I mentioned that staff member that did take that chance on me when I was incarcerated was, Cade Lofton. He was the teacher that worked at the correctional facility who found a way, even though he technically did not have an opening, found a way for me to be able to be one of his tutors. He had 2 tutors at the time. I was the second tutor. And it was because he took that chance that all of this got started. I'm so grateful for that. A lot of my initial skills as an instructor were from him because, like I said, we didn't have training. We had none. We had no training whatsoever. So I had to go off of his example, see how he was teaching and kind of use that as a model. And, aside from Gloria, I've had a lot of other mentors as far as leadership. Frances Banowski was state director prior to Amber Gallup. And she and I had a lot of really wonderful conversations about the field overall for the whole state. She gave me that wider picture, that bigger picture. And Tina Height, I've known Tina since I first started in the field in 2008 in New Mexico and have worked with Tina in various capacities. Tina was my supervisor for NM Delt, and now I'm her supervisor. It's kind of weird. I still have a hard time even seeing it that way, even though that technically is the case. But, she has really taught me a ton about grants and policy and budgeting and really working with the administrative side of things, those nitnoid things that we don't always like, but are very, very important. And Amber Gallup, you and I think, have spoken a lot about Amber and how just absolutely amazing this individual is, how much passion she has for the field, how effective she is as our state director, how tireless it feels she is in providing the leadership and support that we need, that a New Mexico needs as a state. She is literally the person I aspire to be. Amber, if you're listening to this, 100% true. I totally admire Amber's drive, her passion, her integrity, her willingness to go above and beyond no matter what it is, who you are. She's one of the most approachable people I know. You feel like she will make time for you no matter who you are. And so I can't speak enough to all those resources. And it's not just, even though I'm naming these people by name, there are so many people in the field that have made me a better practitioner, that have made me feel like I belong to something, that I do have this purpose, that I'm fulfilling this purpose. I'm so grateful for that, because when I think about the other things, when I think about what I've learned at conferences, when I think about the amazing professional development workshops that I've attended, training from the back of the room being, I think, top of that, because I model a lot of my own training strategies. My own practice is modeled on training from the back of the room, or TBR concepts. So, I don't want to say that that's not important, because it absolutely is. I've learned so much from so many amazing trainers. But I think that it's that one-to-one human connection, when you find those people in your life that really help you to be that person that you are aspiring to be, that person that you're working to become. I think that there's no greater resource than that. So a little bit of a soapbox there. Sorry, but that to me is just invaluable as a resource.
Yeah, so what I'm getting at what you're saying is Amber Gallup, 5 out of 5 director.
Oh, 10, like holding up the sign. 10, all the way, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. Absolutely.
One of the things I really, really appreciate about Amber is when I was trying to figure out what to do in adult ed, one of the strategies my partner suggested to me was to go on LinkedIn and just look up people. And I couldn't figure it out because not every adult ed person is on LinkedIn. So it was really hard. But, being the little dum-dum that I was working part-time, I was buying co-ed. This sounds nerdy and dumb. I don't know. But I feel like I employ the same strategies over and over again. Only recently I realized that I'm doing the same strategies. And one of the strategies was buying resources, usually buying books or print media in the topic, and really hammering down and reading it, analyzing, looking up what is quoted or what's referenced or whatever, and then keep branching off from there, right? And how I met Amber Gal before I moved to New Mexico was that she co-wrote an article in the Co-ed Journal. I can't remember which one it was, but her name was there, and it said instructional designer or something like that. And I was like, whoa, someone is an adult ed and does instructional design, and this is great. So I looked her up on LinkedIn. I just reached out to her, and we had a really nice phone call, and she just told me about her journey, how she got to where this was before she was the director too. So she gave me that space, and some stranger on the internet didn't know, and just answer these questions about adult ed. And then I kept in contact with her. We still follow each other or whatever. And then I find out she became the director of adult education in New Mexico. And I was like, oh, I'm moving to New Mexico. Congratulations also. So we had that little connection. And I feel like she still kind of employs that of she's a very approachable person. And one of the things I really admire about Amber is that she is very approachable, and she will talk to you, whoever you are, whether you're a dad. I hope I'm not blowing up your spot, Amber, but basically it's you can talk to her and kind of pick her brain on certain things when you can. And that kind of stuff is being that approachable, and also being very just there. She's not someone that just is just at her office or at special events. She goes to as much stuff as she can. She's gone to do unofficial site visit, just let's see what's our new building or our classroom or whatever. She's gone to the NMEA conference, of course, too. So it's being on the floor, being approachable. I really respect that. And I was like, you know what? I don't think I'm going to be the director of adult education, but seeing that someone in a high position who is willing to offer advice or to just have a chat with you, I find that very respectable. And I feel like I've been brushed off by people in lower positions. So I find that admirable in a way of maybe I'm not going to be a director or something, but at the very least, as someone in a position of power, because I do work at, I guess, technically the state level because I'm doing professional learning, I am open to talk to people, to share with them, to not to make them feel like there's necessarily a hierarchy between us. And I really respect that.
Definitely.
But getting back to kind of what you were bringing up of mentors, Jamie, you are my mentor. You really helped me better understand the adult ed landscape. You helped me find people to connect to find resources. And that's something that we talked about. A part of career trajectory is meeting people.
Mm-hmm.
And being like having that kind of community. So who is in your community? Where do you want to be? Or what skills do people have? Like I just mentioned that about with Amber and with you, is like, what skills do you guys have that I can learn from, or that I find that I can do in the future? Right. And you're a public speaker, you were a trainer for a very long time. And those are two skills that I'm still working on developing. I'm a very behind the scenes person with certain like training and stuff. But and as mentioned, I have a lot of disabilities. But having that space to talk to people, to learn from, to get opportunities, that is so important. And I'm talking very, like you said, we're talking about very specific people here, but there also is countless people across New Mexico that just having those brief moments of connection have been so beneficial. So like that is a network. And that's something I think we're trying to do in different ways in New Mexico, is like finding new ways to connect with people and collaborate rather than kind of be competitive.
Right.
I think that's something that's been slowly happening over the years. There's definitely just more collaboration, and that's so valuable. So like, back to the question, like what's valuable resources? People is really big.
100%.
Who's in your network? What are they doing? What did they get? How did they get there? Where are their skills? Like that is so invaluable. To get to back to the more personal is like the internet. Learning how to learn, and how I learn is books, internet, and podcasts. I listen to podcasts to get ideas. I listen to podcasts to get a starting point. I listen to podcasts to find out what's going on in the world. So that's my method. I'm not necessarily saying that everyone can learn the same way. I've yet to meet someone, frankly, that learns the way I do. And I'm not saying I learn a super amazing way. It's something that's worked with me and I run with it, which is like reading. Reading is really how I learn. So a big part of that, is like, what are your resources? Like figuring out what have you used before? What has worked for you? And how do you learn, and how do you get to where you want to be? And those are the questions that you need to ask yourself,
Absolutely.
So asking questions is another big thing for me. I ask a lot of questions, and I know I've annoyed you so much over the years.
I have always said, and you know this, that even though in the moment it may not be my favorite thing, I always appreciated those questions, because those questions made me consider things that maybe I hadn't considered before, or thought of things, learned things, forced me to research things, or really reflect on things that I hadn't considered. So again, in the moment, it may not have been my favorite, but it was something I always appreciated.
Oh no, we got real mean to each other too.
Oh, we've had those moments, of course. Yeah. More than once. Yeah.
Contention, yes. But anyway, like knowing what questions to ask and how to ask them, that has been a resource for me that's helped in so many ways. And it's hard to develop. You have to have that curiosity, and you also have to have that space. And not everyone has that space. Right. But I think the reality is like, if you're in a place right now, but you not necessarily do not want to be in that place in the next few years, the next 10 years or 5 or next year or whatever, then you have to start with, then where do you want to be? Backwards design approach, people, is like, where do you want to end up? Figuring that out, and then figuring out how to get there. And we get to our very, very last question, which is, what is your future vision for the adult education professional? So that's very different than what we've been asking. But I think to go ahead, that's a big thing, is you have to have a vision. And a vision, and think of it, in a nonprofit sense of like, you have to it has to be ideal. So there has to be an ideal that you're working towards, And that's why we ask that. It's like, what is, or ask ourselves that rather, is like, what is your vision? So Jamie, what is your vision?
I've talked about this more than once already, but I would really love, it is my vision that adult education become a known and viable career pathway for high school students, for high school equivalency students. We're not even showing our own students for the most part, and I'm not trying to sound accusatory here, but I think for the most part, I don't think we talk to our adult education students about what it would mean to be in the adult ed field as a practitioner. I would love for that to change. I would love for people to aspire to have a career in adult education because adult education is a viable career pathway. In other words, teachers and other practitioners are being paid what they should be paid. They are given benefits. They are given full-time opportunities for growth, for professional growth. And that to me is kind of what makes a career, especially when you're coming into the field as someone who is just out of college, for example, when you're in your 20s or so. That's a long career time. That's a long stretch of a career. So how can we as a field work together to change the landscape in such a way that adult education is something that people want, that in a career in adult education is something that people want? That is my big vision. And part of that is the adult education credential. So I've talked about this. I don't know if I've talked about it in podcast episodes necessarily, but it's no secret that we're working on. And when I say we, Propel, NMEA, and the state office, we are working on an instructor credential that will be state endorsed. So the state would give out this credential for adult education practitioners. And there would be, what we're looking at are 3 different levels of credentialing. And then eventually we want to have an administrator or manager, leader, however you want to call it. But we want to have some kind of administrative credential, data professional credential, support staff even. We want to be able to expand that. And I think having those credentials is part of that vision, in that we are professionalizing the field. We are giving something tangible that people can say, yes, I am a level 1 instructor or a level 1 administrator or level 2 or level 3. There's nothing that is mandated by the state for adult education practitioners. And I'm not saying that I want it necessarily to be mandated where you have to have it or else you can't have a job, because that's just not the reality, unfortunately. That's not the reality. In a lot of areas, we're not going to be able to do that. But to have it as an option, I think would go a long way in professionalizing the field and giving us the clout that we deserve. And again, working toward that vision of making a career in adult education something that people do aspire to have. So yeah, when I really think about that as a vision, that's the crux of it, is that I want more people to want this as a career, because what it has given me, where I've been, where I'm going, I have this opportunity to absolutely love what I do. And I would love for more people to be able to experience that because they know about it, because they're working toward it. So yeah, that's my vision.
That's lovely. I don't know if my vision really differs from that, but my vision is a fully realized adult education system where practitioners are compensated fairly for their knowledge, experience, and growth and skill set, where professional learning is a vital part of their work. That practitioners have the space to grow professionally and get paid for that. I want to keep emphasizing that you get paid for the work that you put in, and that and in the way that you want to. So it's kind of what we said earlier, was like sometimes some of the trajectory is just like moving into a management, right? And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but in my fully realized vision is that there are so many more opportunities beyond just that, like more teacher leaders, having more professional development, like having teachers who do, and we try to do that at Propel as much as we can, but having teachers do professional development, like, lead it, create it.
Right.
Having admin create professional learning, right? Developing like really creative projects, having access to multimodal resources. So like all the opportunities that you can to get your professional learning needs met, that you have the space to grow as a practitioner, and it doesn't necessarily look like because you're doing 3 jobs,
Right.
but you have one job that you do really well. And there's room for growth, and you have that rest time, and you're fairly compensated, and you get benefits and all this stuff. And my vision is that adult education is seen as a professional field with growth opportunities that's to support all staff and students. Our students are very important, and I don't ever want to take away from that. But one thing that I feel like gets lost sometimes is that we don't consider ourselves as practitioners. It's kind of like all for the students. And I've seen something similar in the healthcare field, where sometimes practitioners are expected to just give it their all, and everything is for their, for their patient's health, whatever that looks like, or client health. But what does that mean for you? And that's like a really big question. And I want people to ask themselves that. Why are you here? What are you getting out of this? What keeps you here? What drives you? And where do you want to go? Being a part of a field, being a part of an industry means that you're contributing to it. So, and you are contributing just by going to work, but like how and why and in what ways? And in what ways do you want to contribute? I would love to see so many more opportunities for people to like do something really different. Part of like my role as a professional learning coordinator is I manage the DEL team, so the distance education learning technology team. And one of my vision or my goals for the consultants that work for me is that you are given this space within constraint, of course, like, because they are within the constraint of it has to be a professional learning opportunity that has to do with distance education and learning technology. But I try to give them as much space as they can of like being creative. What are ways that they can be creative in this role that they can't in their others? And that's kind of like my kind of vision of like, I want you to go crazy. Like, what is your wildest idea within the time frame that we have? And I keep telling my staff this too, of like, no, you make sure you put that on your timesheet. You're getting paid for that. That is important. And I want to emphasize that. So like, what are your ideas? How do you want to grow? Because we grow when our interests and our needs are met. You don't grow when you're bored.
Sure.
I mean, boredom leads to creativity because it gets you to a point where you have to, not be bored anymore. But you're not going to grow in a job where you just feel like you're stagnating. So that is important to just really think about. And I think this is a lot of reflection today in today's episode.
Definitely. Yeah. And I really appreciated having that opportunity. I really have enjoyed this conversation, and I really hope that our listeners take the opportunity to do the same. Reflect, like you were saying, all those questions that you were wanting folks to ask of themselves. I think those are so crucial. And I would love it if people would share. And I'm going to let you take that part over because I know that's not part of what I was supposed to talk about. But how can people share?
Yes. So we please ask that people share their experiences, share, comment, like, subscribe to our YouTube channel, to our other modalities of listening. So iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, however you're listening to us, share, talk to us, reach out via email. Please. We also send this in our listservs, right? In our New Mexico listservs. Please reach out and tell us about your journey. Tell us about your questions, where you've been, where you want to be. We want to hear it.
I will also mention that we now have a feedback form that is on our website. And so if you go to nmadulted.org and you go to the podcast page, if you scroll down, you'll be able to see our feedback form. If you have feedback that you would like to share privately, whether it's feedback on an existing episode like this one, where you want to share with us, you want us to contact you, we're happy to do that. You can also give us ideas for upcoming episodes. If you have something that you would just love for us to talk about, whether you want to be on the podcast or not, And I highly recommend that you offer to be a guest on our podcast. I think I would love for people to volunteer to do that. What would you love to talk about? Give us some ideas. We'd love to hear them. Go to our website. We will have that feedback form on our podcast page.
Yes, thank you, Jamie. To emphasize, please make our jobs easier. Identify yourselves and give us episode ideas.
Yeah. I'd love that help.
Absolutely. Because we know there's incredible things happening, on the ground in adult ed. Because of our networks, we are privy to a good amount of information, but there's always something to learn. There's always something to share. And if you're not sure, or you just have a germ of idea and need to develop it, please use that feedback form. We will be in contact. We will talk to you. We will work with you. Probably most likely me. Let's be real.
Yeah.
Jamie got all the technical stuff down. I got the other stuff. So,
Yes.
So I will work with you. I will talk to you. We can have a conversation. We can do a phone call. We can do a Google Meet. We could just go back and forth in email, GChat, or chat, whatever they're calling it these days. But I am open and ready to hear from you.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jamie. This was a very illuminating conversation. It was a lot of fun. I guess, look, now we know we can do different things. There you go.
Absolutely. We tried it. It's working. Maybe we'll do it again. So yes, thank you, Nadia. I appreciate it. And I look forward to more episodes coming up for the rest of the year.
Mm-hmm.
Connect with Adult Ed, the NMEA podcast, is a project of the Propel Professional Learning System and is funded by the New Mexico Higher Education Department's Adult Education Division. Thank you for listening.